As a fellow traveler in building a movement for peace and social justice, it is my pleasure to introduce our special guest, who is another Carolyn. Carolyn, by the way, means courage, even though now Carolyn Eisenberg, our speaker, also has the nickname Rusti, so we'll call her Rusti Eisenberg, co-founder of Brooklyn for Peace and professor of U.S. History and American Foreign Policy at Hofstra University.
In my talk today, I've been asked to speak about challenges and opportunities for the peace movement in a polarized time. I want to take just a few minutes, and I promise it's just a few minutes, to describe the evolution of Brooklyn for Peace, because some of that experience is relevant to our future. As some of you know, we began in 1983 during the Reagan years. We were not an activist group, just a discussion group of parents whose children attended open house nursery school. But we were people who were part of that activist generation of the 60s. And we were noticing now that we were parents and in our 30s that we had become very narrow in our focus, that we were concerned with the details of our kids' lives, which seemed to take up endless amounts of space, and we're even ignoring the horrors of the Reagan administration. So we came together to talk about that and to share our concerns and to figure out ways to be more active. Our immediate interest was the ludicrous plan of the Reagan administration to establish a nuclear missile base in Staten Island. Those ships would be fitted to carry likely nuclear-armed cruise missiles, and a crash in the harbor could result in a plutonium link that would endanger the lives of thousands. And associated with this was the Navy, not surprisingly, that was eager to avoid an environmental impact statement before they arrived. So, anointing ourselves Brooklyn Parents for Peace, we set out to oppose this. And to our surprise, there was a great deal of interest in these developments, and we quickly became a growing activist organization. The reasons for that were pretty clear. For Brooklyn parents, this missile was really, really close. And this not implausible plutonium leak was a direct threat to our kids. Something that was much more scary than the usual things that we tended to worry about. It was also local. There was something that city government could do about it by insisting on an environmental impact statement. So that was, all those circumstances really helped us to grow. And in subsequent decades, our organization kept growing, but in bursts rather than steadily. It was at moments of crisis that the constituency for peace surged. The crucial period was, of course, 9/11, when hundreds of people in Brooklyn neighborhoods were interested in affiliating. And that's when we became Brooklyn for Peace, because it more accurately reflected the diversity of our participants. I think it's worth reflecting on some of the relevant factors that accounted for the surge at that point. 9/11 and its aftermath were very local. Many residents knew someone in the towers or the first responders. Here in New York City, everybody's life was personally disrupted. And our Muslim neighbors were attacked and traumatized, some outrageously rounded up and imprisoned in the Metropolitan Detention Center here in Brooklyn. There's also a genuine debate in the country about how our government should respond. And of course, once the attack on Iraq commenced, young men and women from Brooklyn were being sent there. I'm mentioning these circumstances because as we go forward and try to grow a peace movement further, the present context looms. The title of my talk this morning, Pathways to Peace, Challenges and Opportunities in a Polarized Time. And that title immediately conjures up the Trumpers and the grave threat to democracy posed by the Republican Party, unwilling to observe institutional norms. So we're really in a new phase of danger. And we know we're in trouble when Liz Cheney has become the torch of high principle and courage. However, New York City is not overburdened by Trumpers. And what's relevant to the peace movement is something different. One of the unmarked consequences of the toxic domestic divisions we have, namely the extent to which a hawkish foreign and military policy has been slipping back almost unnoticed, with significant support from Democrats in Congress and the ostensibly liberal news media, not to mention the circle of experts rotating in and out of government positions and think tanks, most recently dubbed the blob, which is probably a pretty good description. But my point is that the polarized political atmosphere, I really want to emphasize this, has made other things go under the radar that are very serious in terms of issues of war and peace. And I'm going to touch very briefly on some dimensions of that regarding 4 interrelated issues: the military budget, the hysteria about China, the hostility towards Russia, and the response to the Afghanistan withdrawal and the never-ending war on terror. To be very clear, I'm not giving a list of objectionable policies, of which there are many, but specifically wanting to talk about some examples of how, against the backdrop of domestic polarization, liberal challenges have been muted or even abandoned. I want to speak first about the military budget. As of now, the military budget for 2022 has not been passed, but the process is underway. And a major development was passage of the National Defense Authorization Act by the House of Representatives in September 23rd, 2021. This measure authorized approximately $771 billion for the upcoming fiscal year. That was roughly about $740 billion for the Department of Defense and another $31 billion for the Energy Department, much of it for nuclear weapons. The most money ever spent, and more money than Joe Biden even asked for. An incredible development. And of course, many of the items being paid for were at best wasteful and at worst dangerous. So what goodies were they? A new generation of nuclear-armed bombers, submarines, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. The latter especially worrisome, the ICBMs, because these are some of the most dangerous weapons in the world, because the president would have only minutes to decide whether to launch them. If there was a warning of an attack, maybe that could even be a mistake, but there's not really time to deliberate. And there's money for new submarine-launched nuclear-armed cruise missiles. So here we are, back to those missiles that the Reagan administration was planning to put in Staten Island, but they'll presumably go some other friendlier place. And it's paying for F-35 airplanes, $12 billion for that, where technical flaws have been a continuing issue. Not even clear that it could be used in combat. It's been sucking up money for years. But like so much in the bill, the benefits of a lot of these expenditures will be going to the contractors, many of whom, of course, are donating to political figures. So Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, Honeywell, all these folks are going to benefit from this expenditure. And we should also notice, in case we get too cheered up, that the $771 billion in the NDAA is independent of other national security expenditures for the VA, for veterans, for the CIA, for the Department of Homeland Security. When you bring all these other things into focus, William Hartung, who is an expert on these things, estimates the real cost of military-related matters for 2022 is closer to $1.3 trillion. By way of comparison, it's worth pausing on the stalled Build Back Better bill that's been stuck in Congress as of this morning. And that bill was originally described as 3.5 trillion, now it's 1.75 trillion, maybe it won't even happen. But lost in that description is the point that that money is over a 10-year period. So when you think about the amount allocated for 2022, we're talking about a figure closer to $175 $5 billion for the coming year. The NDAA figure for this coming year is 4 times as much. So while Congress struggles to pay for dentists and eyeglasses for seniors, the never working F-35 combat plane goes sliding through, still afloat. Not to mention all those missiles and new nuclear warheads that they're being about. But this isn't just about money. It's about national priorities. Well, I'm sorry, it's not just about money or national priorities, which are obviously expressed in all of these developments in Congress. But an important point to keep in mind about these huge military budgets and the vast national security complex which they spawn is that the very existence of these things creates a disposition for military responses to international challenges. Or if not military action, then a propensity for very high risk foreign policy. I think it's always important to keep that in mind. It's not just money we're blowing away. It's also creating a tilt towards policies in a certain direction. Against that background, I want to very briefly mention the deteriorating US relationship with the Russians and the Chinese. Another area where the liberal voice has been largely absent or worse. This is not to say that Russia and China are blameless, flawless countries, but just to emphasize that the US handling of these relationships is making everything worse. A word about Russia. For 2 years, Americans following the mainstream media, and I'm talking here not about Fox or other right-wing organs, but the mainstream ones, or what we'd like to think of as mainstream, MSNBC, CNN. People watching these programs were inundated with anti-Russian news. And of course, the goal was to nail Donald Trump, and that seemed like the best hammer to use. To me, the habit was exemplified by Rachel Maddow, who used her television show to whip up concern. I want to sidestep for a moment the question of to what extent the Russians did try to help Donald Trump get to be president. But I have to say, as a professor of American foreign policy, it was startling to me how stripped of context these accusations were. After all, influencing elections is an old American habit. Even overthrowing governments is an American habit. The list of these occurrences and various tactics, planting false articles in newspapers, bribing politicians, funding demonstrations, there's endless examples, whether in post-World War II Europe, Central Latin America, to post-Gorbachev Russia itself. Now, I personally don't think that countries should interfere with each other's elections. But what the mainstream media did in its effort to nail Trump was to make Russian behavior seem uniquely malevolent. And of course, Vladimir Putin, the resurrection of Stalin. Lost in that was any attention to substantive questions of US-Russian relations. This included the still catastrophic decision of Bill Clinton to expand NATO, the US complicity in the overthrow of Ukraine's pro-Russian government, and the continuing effort to this very day to keep building military power along the Russian border. I mean, just think if this was Canada or think if it was Mexico. What I'm suggesting is that under the umbrella of anti-Trump organizing, an altogether irresponsible, provocative policy towards Russia has developed largely unquestioned by liberals or the progressive left. And again, I want to be clear, this is not to say that the Russians are blameless for the tension. They were never blameless, but we are very far from a thoughtful restoration of cooperative relations. Then we get to China, and I'm going to try to be very brief here, but here as well, the policy of the United States, and this is bipartisanship, because this is something where we're all getting together, Democrats and Republicans. Policy has been to deepen the tensions rather than to reduce them, and to take actions which on the one hand run the risk of a military clash, And on the other, reduce the possibility of a close collaboration on climate change, on health, public health issues, and other matters of vital concern. This whipping up of the China issue is no small thing, because it has become integrally tied to the case for all those military dollars, that's $771 billion to be specific, which most of our representatives just voted for. And by the way, which the Senate Armed Service Committee passed 23-3, with only one Democrat, Elizabeth Warren, dissenting. Kirsten Gillibrand voted for that budget, probably because there was something about, you know, how the military was going to handle sexual assault. So there are powerful forces with an interest in making things worse. You know, and it's interesting, before this, we started our Zoom, you know, came on my phone, you know, from the Hill, the news, the amazing news that, that congressional representatives and senators and the Department of Defense are increasingly worried that China is investing in nuclear weapons and potential delivery over a long period, over great distances. So that the new flash, we could get these flashes constantly. And the point about it is that there's deliberate effort to magnify these things, right? And so it's a serious effort to think about nuclear weapons coming from China. Well, by the way, we have thousands more weapons than they do. We would be entering negotiations about this. But as we've seen time and time again, the Defense Department and members of Congress have a stake in making these threats sound as ominous as possible. And they do that because it provides the justification for more military expenditures. So again, I'm highlighting these things because these are areas where, you know, the progressive side, there are definitely people working on all these issues. There's some great groups doing things. I don't mean to make it uniform, but I think certainly in terms of the Democratic Party, its progressives as well as its so-called moderates, I think the picture is not very impressive. I also want to just say briefly, I'm looking now at my time here. And actually, I'm rushing a little through China. We might want to come back to the tensions that are growing about Taiwan. But I want to say something finally about the reaction to the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. And in their analysis of the election results that just happened, pollsters found that a significant number of people were highly critical of the Biden administration for a rapid exit from Afghanistan. And in a way, it's kind of ridiculous. Like I saw in the Washington Post, they were, oh, isn't that interesting? People are upset about it. Well, the Washington Post had been publishing hysterical articles for 2 weeks about how this was messy, this was chaotic, this was violent, this was unplanned. So the fact then that people in Virginia thought, that was really bad, it's not exactly a surprise when we have the media whipping that up. I think you saw the same thing on MSNBC, you know, as if this is the worst possible thing. What happened in the airport was horrible. What's happening to individual people is horrible. But at the same time that we've had this almost exclusive focus on the airport where this human tragedy was occurring, there was almost complete neglect of the situation in the rest of the country, where people's lives have been torn apart by ongoing violence, much of it attributable to American bombing and raids. This has been going on for years, and very little coverage or attention by the mainstream media, and very few comments about this by our elected officials. There's also a lot of blaming of the Afghan government and the security forces for giving up, but very little recognition of the US role in propping the government and security forces up, all of which contributed to the remobilization of the Taliban, which had been going on for years. The situation at the airport was messy because the United States and the allied Afghan government had lost the war, and there was no negotiated settlement. But in discussing the Afghanistan issue in this way, an opportunity to illuminate the perils of US military intervention in countries went forfeit. as almost all US politicians remain silent about the withdrawal, or more commonly sharply critical of President Biden, who, by the way, had almost no chance to do anything different because given the Trump agreement with the Taliban, had Biden said, oh, by the way, we're going to stay, he would have faced the next day rising American casualties. So it was fine to let Biden take the blame, but our progressive representatives were mostly quiet. Why does that matter? You said, well, the Afghanistan situation bad, but it's ended. Well, it's bad for a number of reasons, including the fact that it's making it impossible to have serious discussion about how to prevent starvation from, overtaking that country with millions of kids and adults actually starving. So that's a bad thing. But also relevant is that by being silent on Afghanistan, what's left in place are American special ops forces that are all across the Middle East and in Africa. On any given day, there are thousands of special ops units that are active in as many as in any given week, that there's as many of thousands of special ops forces that are doing something or other in 80 different countries. Some of that something or other is, training people, educating people, but some of it is killing people. And we're not discussing that. My main point here is that among the eclipsed issues in our polarized country is this ongoing process of continuing a war on terror with these small units of American military that are empowered to intervene in whatever way they think fit. Now, the things I've been talking about this morning, all of these things, I'm bringing up because I think these are things that are very troubling, that have been overshadowed by the polarization and the very real danger in our country that have been revealed by the Trump presidency. I began this talk saying a little bit about how Brooklyn for Peace has continued to grow over these decades. What are some of the circumstances that have enabled that to happen? And I want to just turn to the future very briefly. And to say the obvious, which is that that the conditions that have made peace organizing somewhat easier in the past are less easy right now, because folks in Brooklyn and elsewhere have been confronted with a range of dramatic threats, the pandemic certainly, but also the unmet challenge of climate change, the unprecedented threat to our democracy generated by the Trumpers and the extreme Republican Party. So it's harder to gain people's attention for issues of war and peace. And I think we have to acknowledge it. But at the same time, we could also say it's not impossible to do this. The military budget provides one point of access to these larger dangers. As many of you know, there's already in place a Move the Money campaign endorsed by a variety of New York City organizations, and that effort could grow and improve. There's also the particular fact that on congressional matters here in Brooklyn, we have a special advantage. Two of the most powerful members of Congress, Senator Schumer and Representative Jeffries, who's looking like could be the successor to Nancy Pelosi. These people are our neighbors, maybe not our friends, they're our neighbors. And if we were able to build a strong, visible peace constituency here in this borough, this would ramify nationally. High in the list of the to-do list is the importance of establishing firm links with the climate change movement, as well as other groups dealing with inequality, poverty, and justice here in New York City. Now, we're all kind of good about getting organizational names on a list, but one of the challenges before us is how do we make those connections real? How do we really bring them to life so that we're coordinating in a much more meaningful way? We need to consider outreach to younger people and figure out initiatives which can give us access to local schools and universities, private as well as public. And we need to do a much better job of educating a broader public on the dangers of militarism to our democracy, so that we're not playing catch up when the next war breaks out, but we've laid the foundation for real political change. If you think about political events this week, where Congress struggles to find money for people's dentists. I mean, really stop and think how ridiculous that is, right? The socialist Bernie Sanders wants to get hearing aids for old people. I mean, that, anything be silly. Or if you have a sick relative, that the person who has to take care of them for 2 months, is available to do it. When you think about Congress going meeting hour after hour, but oh, amazing. How do we find the money for these things? And consider, on the other hand, that we have thousands of nuclear warheads and we're building more intercontinental ballistic missiles. This is absolutely absurd. So why can't we find ways to explain this to people? Why can't we break in? Somehow or other, we have to do a better job with that. Beyond that, I want to recognize the ongoing role of ethical culture in advocating for peace, diplomacy, and hope, and to recognize many of you in the audience who we have worked with and collaborated with over the years and look forward to doing so in the future. Thank you.